So I want to thank Jens for the invitation to come here this morning and have an opportunity to share with you some insights into the topic of systematic reviews. And I changed the title a little bit to say, does systematic reviews get us closer to the truth? And I'd like to start with the answer to that. And the answer is yes, depending on whether or not the systematic review is done correctly or not. And the problem is that everybody and their cousin are doing systematic reviews. So for example, if you look at the number of systematic reviews that were published in PubMed over the last 40 years, you can see that there's exponential growth because, as Jens says, people can do this in the evenings after they drain spinal infections. And so there's a whole host of systematic reviews that are out there now in the literature. So I guess we need to ask the question, well, what is a systematic review? And a systematic review is a specialized kind of literature review. It's one that uses rigorous, systematic, and transparent methods. And the purpose of this is to try to minimize bias in the results. And we need that. We need that as human beings. We need ways to limit our biases because of the human condition. Even Sherlock Holmes noted that it's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. It's the condition we have. It's the human condition that even the great philosopher Yogi Berra noted when he said, I wouldn't have seen it if I didn't believe it. And that's the way it is with us. So there are obstacles out there that prevent us or limit us from coming to the truth. And these are some obstacles that systematic reviews attempt to overcome. So now there are other kinds of reviews other than systematic reviews, and generally we call these reviews narrative reviews. And they tend to be less structured. They tend to not have rigorous methodological parameters, and they tend to be more biased. And one needs to be careful, and one needs to look with a critical eye when you see a systematic review published in order to know whether it's a narrative review in disguise or whether it really is a systematic review. Now, there are methods, sort of checklists, if you will, by which one can assess the quality of a systematic review. I want to pick out a half a dozen or so of these to go over today, and trying to keep in mind that many of you are consumers of the medical literature. You want to know the truth about, in this case, what we're talking about today, therapeutic intervention, a treatment, for example. You want to know the truth about a treatment. And one way that you can determine whether or not a systematic review is a good one or not is to pick out some of these sort of key characteristics to look at in making that determination. So we're going to look at a few of these here today. And we're going to do it by looking at two systematic reviews, both looking at a similar intervention for a similar condition, and that is lumbar radiculopathy and the effect of spinal injections. One was published in 2013 in the Journal of Pain Medicine. That's the top one. And the other one was published a few months earlier in 2012 in the Annals of Internal Medicine. Now, the first key that you should look at when you pick up a paper on a systematic review is you want to make sure that you understand what the objective is in the systematic review. And the objective, the aim, the purpose, the key question that they're trying to get at should be framed in a way where you can understand something about this acronym we call PCOS, okay? And PICO stands for the population of interest, the intervention, the control, the outcome, and then the study design. And so you're hoping that the objective will declare all of those to you. So let's take a look at these two systematic reviews. The first one that was done in the Pain Medicine Journal state this as their objective: to determine the effectiveness of lumbar transforaminal injection of steroids in the treatment of radicular pain. So in reading that particular objective, does it give you an idea? So I'm asking this question to the group about the population of interest. What's the population of interest there?
Is Glenn still here? Glenn, what do you think?
Okay, patients with lumbar radicular pain. I think you can get that from that objective. And so I'll give that credit for that particular characteristic. What about the intervention? It's going to pick mine.
Looking at the intervention, it would be lumbar transforaminal injections.
Okay, so I think that he did a good job of declaring that. How about the control group? Yeah, we don't know what the control group is there. I didn't mention it. How about the outcomes? What are the outcomes they're assessing?
Effectiveness.
Okay, effectiveness, but how are we measuring effectiveness there? He doesn't really say, so I'm not going to give him credit for the outcomes. And how about the study design? The study design, I'm not going to ask you about that because this is a subtle one. I'm personally going to give him credit for study design because he uses the word effectiveness, and there's a difference between efficacy and effectiveness in the strictest sense of the term. He may not have known that he was using the right term. I don't know, but I'm going to give him credit. Effectiveness implies both randomized trials and observational studies. Observational studies being natural experiments, real life treatment, if you will. It might be the case where they let the practitioner decide what kind of steroid to use, or the patients weren't randomized, but Clinic A all got the steroid and Clinic B all got saline or whatever. Okay, so there wasn't a random process. And so that's what the word effectiveness means. Efficacy is a little bit tighter term, and it refers in the clinical sense to randomized trials. That is, you limit a lot of the extraneous variables to see if your treatment and only your treatment is what's working. So I'm going to give him credit for that. So let's compare that with the article by Pinto that was in the Annals. And so his stated objective is to determine the efficacy, different term, of all three anatomical approaches, that is caudal, interlaminar, and transforaminal. The other one just looked at transforaminal, to epidural corticosteroid injection in the management of sciatica compared with placebo-controlled interventions. So I think we will agree that it's a similar population, a little bit different intervention, although he does stratify his results by transforaminal, so he has the same information as the other one, but he adds to that the other two approaches. He has a control group. He says we're going to compare this with a placebo control intervention. Doesn't state the outcome. I'm not going to give him credit for that. And then the study design I'm going to give him credit for again because he used efficacy. These are randomized trials only. So the first one has randomized trials plus observational studies. This has randomized trials only. So when you think of the importance of a structured systematic review, one thing that you have to think about carefully is which articles are included and which are not included, and how you end up picking the articles that you're going to summarize in your systematic review. And that should be demonstrated, usually in a figure such as this, which is a figure out of the consort literature, which basically tells the reader how you got from A to C, okay? And I highlighted this one area, as you can see, which talks about those articles that are excluded. And what needs to be done, if you really want to be a good consumer of systematic reviews, you should look at whether or not the systematic review not only identifies the articles that they looked at, that they read, the full text, and excluded because it didn't meet criteria, and if they listed why they didn't meet the criteria. So let's take a look at our two studies. The first one, they had no inclusion or exclusion criteria at all, so I couldn't put anything else up there but that. Let's take a look when that was published in the Annals. You can see they have a pretty robust inclusion criteria. They have some exclusion criteria as well. And so you get a sense that these people were more careful in establishing parameters around the articles that they wanted to include in their review. And then this is their flow diagram here, okay? And so they're able to tell you the number of articles that they at least looked at the abstract and the title of, and then the ones that they pooled and reviewed the full text of, and then they identify the numbers of those and the reasons why they didn't include it. Now, this particular article should have, if they wanted to go one step further, provided a list of the citations in the exclusion article, because sometimes you'll be familiar as a consumer of the literature, you'll be familiar with an article that wasn't included, and you'll want to know why didn't they include it. And they should have identified that for you. And then also it's a more reproducible kind of thing. So anyway, the important part of that, of those 2 or 3 slides I just showed you, is that a systematic review should have clear, well-defined inclusion and exclusion criteria, just like a research study. And then the systematic review should identify the articles and describe them for you. You should have some idea of the characteristics of the studies that are included. We didn't find any in the first article by McVicker. You don't know what the study characteristics are unless you are familiar with the studies. But if you look at the one by the Annals, that was published in the Annals, you can see that it's quite robust. They give you not only patient characteristics, they give you sample size, they give you intervention characteristics, and so it gives you a lot of good information. And this is really important because the results of papers often disagree with each other. Individual papers, I'm not talking about systematic reviews. Individual papers often don't agree with each other. They're heterogeneous in their results. And this kind of information helps you to go back and see if you can identify what is it about those 2 papers that are not the same, that might account for the difference in the results. This is very important characteristic of a good systematic review. Another key characteristic is how the authors synthesize the results. This can be done really in 2 ways. Okay? One way, which is not a very good way, is to provide the results by the individual study. The second way is to combine the results by outcome across the different studies. And these 2 systematic reviews illustrate those 2 ways. So this first one summarized the results by study. And so you can see that this particular author describes the first prospective study, showed this spinal injection using dexamethasone achieving significantly better group improvement in pain at 30 days and at 6 months than blind interlaminar injection of steroids. But the data provided did not allow success rates to be calculated. And then he talks about another prospective study compared this. And then if you were to read on, he talks about a third study and a fourth study, and some report pain and some report success and some report surgery, and so it's hard to get your arms around that that particular message when it's presented that way. Let's compare that with the study by Pinto. So Pinto presents his data by outcome. So the first outcome is leg pain, at least the one that I'm illustrating here. And he does it for short term and he does it for long term. So he takes those authors that report pain and he combines those papers and he presents the information in a way that comes up with an overall impression of leg pain. And then he goes on to do back pain, he goes on to do overall pain, he does disability. And so you get a sense as to what the body of literature says about a particular outcome. So another key to looking at a systematic review is, did the individual who assessed the systematic review, who wrote the systematic review, did they somehow make a judgment about the quality of the individual articles? And so I thought this was an interesting statement by McVicker. He says articles were not scored and ranked for quality, largely because scales for this purpose have not been validated, which isn't entirely true, but also in order to avoid complicating the review with technicalities. Instead, the data of each publication were appraised for how well they supported the effectiveness of the procedure in question. So I'm not sure, that seems mushy to me. Yes, Dave.
It's basically a narrative review.
Yes. Yes, it's a narrative review disguised as a systematic review. And if you were to look at the title, he's even very careful on how we'll go back and look at the title at the end just to illustrate your point. In contrast, Pinto evaluates every article against a particular methodological characteristic, which you see as the column headings there. And these are all methodological characteristics that we know can affect bias. Okay, lastly, the last key I want to point out is conflict of interest. And McVicker says that, well, first of all, he doesn't state any potential conflict of interest, but if you look at the authors on the paper, the senior author happens to be the corresponding author as well. So if you have any questions about the paper, you have to write to the senior author. Senior author is a prominent member of the International Association for the Study of Pain. He's a pain doctor. And, pain doctors do injections. And so I think that's important to declare. The reader needs to know that, okay? The reader needs to know that. Now, does that mean it's going to automatically bias the paper? Not automatically, but it's information you as a consumer should know. So on the left there, you can see that Pinto, in his paper, I wrote it down, has a section called Potential Conflicts of Interest, and he says disclosures can be viewed at this particular website. So I went to that website, and sure enough, all of the disclosures for each of the authors are presented there. And so I printed just a piece of one from one of the authors, and you can see that that particular author says, yes, I have some potential conflicts of interest. And he lists them there as money that goes to his institution, and the reason why. And then he has checked off that he personally gets something, and I thought the comments were rather amusing on the the contributions he gets, chocolate and wine for giving talks. So I'm looking forward to my bottle of wine after this. So here we have 2 systematic reviews. And the reason that I bring this up is because I'm currently in the middle of doing a new systematic review for the state of Washington on spinal injections. It's actually an update on a report that we did 5 years ago or 6 years ago. And so we're updating it with new information. And the reason that this was brought to my attention is because there was a lengthy editorial. Somebody wrote a letter to the editor. I should have put the information in here. And they basically were saying, boy, this systematic review by McVicker is fantastic. It's great. It contrasts with this other one by Pinto, and Pinto has all kinds of problems with his systematic review. And I'm thinking, well, that's interesting. So you look up the people who are writing the letter to the editorial. Again, these are pain management physicians who have an interest in spinal injections, and some of the same ones who are writing critiques of my systematic review wrote the letter to the editor. And so I thought, well, let me compare these two and see if this guy's right. And when I started looking at it, I think it's just the opposite. It's just the opposite. So the conclusions here is that, hey, this is as good as sliced bread, and it's beneficial. It's beneficial for a lot of patients, for a substantial proportion of patients. Pinto comes to a different conclusion, and even for the subset of patients that are identical, the transforaminal injection people, he says that the available evidence suggests that epidural corticosteroid injections offer only short-term relief of leg pain, and I think his time period was 2 weeks, and after that it disappears. And even during those 2 weeks, the difference was statistically different, but it wasn't really that big of a clinical difference. And so he raises the question about whether this is really a clinically useful modality, and at least needs to be looked at more carefully and not just accepted so readily. So I just want to summarize here by saying that as a consumer of the literature, if you really want to know something about the truth of your intervention, and I think you said, Jens, that we have nurses, we have physical therapists, we have surgeons, and maybe we have some other clinicians as well. All of you ought to be consumers of the medical literature to see if what you're doing, what the truth about that really is. And know that you yourself are going to be prone to bias, and that a good systematic review will help to cut through some of that bias, and will help you to, I think, be a better clinician in the long run. And so consider some of these characteristics when you look at a systematic review. Look to see whether they've defined their objective. Look to see if they have this inclusion-exclusion criteria. See if they describe the studies and give you the characteristics that are in the systematic review. Did they evaluate the quality of the review? Did they provide you the results by outcome in a way that sort of pulls the results together? And did they declare anything about their conflict of interest? And so, again, I want to thank Jens, and I want to thank the Institute for having me here, and I appreciate it and hope to come back sometime soon. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Bill.